Creative nonfiction is my favorite genre to write in. It's also one of my favorite things to read. And one subset of creative nonfiction is personal reportage, which is really the act of being an eyewitness to the world or what's going on in the world. It's writing about current events with style. As much as the novel coronavirus has impacted the lives of nearly everyone on the planet, it has also given writers a unique moment in history about which to write. In the midst of a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic, the world is experiencing political unrest, protests and riots, bombings, police brutality, civil rights challenges, voting challenges, international conflict, and the most divided political world in more than a century. We're living history. The world is on fire, and writers are eyewitnesses to the world. We can't turn on the news, the TV, the streaming device, the internet, or even meme threads on Reddit without seeing reference to some shocking new event that impacts ourselves and our world. No one should recognize the opportunity in the chaos more than writers. Newspapers and journals at the moment are filled with opinion pieces and personal essays, but those are only the tip of the creative nonfiction iceberg. Creative nonfiction encompasses a broad range of nonfiction, but is explained concisely, as the editors of creative nonfiction magazines say, true stories well told. Creative nonfiction uses the same literary devices as fiction to tell a true story. I often call this life writing because it's about our true life, but the key is to make the story less academic, or maybe less journalistic, and more creative, essentially to tell it as a story rather than a dry report. Examples of creative nonfiction include personal essays, autobiographies, memoir, lyric essays, literary journalism, humor, spiritual essays, travel essays, nature and environmental writing, and on, because the genre is both hard to define and hard to tie into a neat little bow. But infinite possibility is the joy of creative nonfiction. The personal essay, a primary creative nonfiction form, has been around for thousands of years, hundreds of years, at least as Montaigne. There's some earlier Greek works as well that are considered the personal essay. But a more recent example is Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. Capote once called his work a nonfiction novel. While some suggest that Capote's work is just a true crime novel, in fact, what he wrote was more literary. As he noted, it seemed to me that journalism, reportage, could be forced to yield a serious new art form. Personal reportage owes much of its modern birth to Capote and what he saw as a melding of journalism and literature, which provided a window into the events in Holcomb, Kansas, but also were a reflection on the human condition. He said, "When I first formed my theories concerning the nonfiction novel, many people felt that what I proposed, a narrative form that employed all the techniques of fictional art, but was nevertheless immaculately factual, was little more than a literary solution for fatigued novelists suffering from, quote, a failure of imagination. Personally, I felt that this attitude represented a failure of imagination on their part." Oftentimes, personal reportage focuses on current events in which the writer has personal involvement, which opens up like a window into a new world for the reader. Rather than concise writing, such as one reads in the Sunday News, however, personal reportage uses storytelling techniques often wielded in fiction writing. To further develop the concept of personal reportage, writer and essayist Philip Gerard said, "The best nonfiction writers are first-rate reporters, reliable eyewitnesses focused on the world, not themselves, and relentless researchers with the imagination to understand the implications of their discoveries." This is the form used by Gloria Steinem in her 1963 A Bunny's Tale. And yes, 1963 is a little bit time ago. But it's kind of that same era where a lot of this was being explored. Steinem, a staunch feminist, immersed herself as a cocktail waitress in the Playboy Club in the early 60s. Obviously not the place for a feminist. This immersive journalism is still held as a groundbreaking expose, quote, fresh and relevant as ever. She didn't simply report the story, she became a primary element in the story and was able to shine a light on a hidden world that reflected the human condition in her time. In the world of global intelligence, Five Eyes are the intelligence services of Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United Kingdom, and the United States. But in the world of personal reportage, the Five Eyes of inquiry include immersion, interviews, the internet, information, and imagination. We're going to talk about all of these, but I want to note here that a key caveat is that personal reportage requires fact-based inquiry. So while creative nonfiction uses the fictional skill sets, the facts remain facts. So don't make them up. Interviewing is a skill set every writer should master. Develop a list of questions prior to the actual interview. Make them open-ended rather than simple yes or no questions, and write them down, because no matter the amount of preparation, even the best researcher will forget a question when depending on the very fallible human brain. When it comes time for the actual interview, be it over email, the phone, internet, or in person, writers should work hard to develop a relationship with the interview subject. This isn't a cross-examination. Start with simple questions designed to put the subject at ease. Leave long pauses that give the subject time to fill the quiet with additional information. Quiet, silence, is one of those things that humans feel compelled to fill, so give them that quiet so they will fill it with more information for you. Really listen to what they say and ask follow-up questions. Save the tougher questions for the end of the interview, so if the subject objects, and they inevitably will, the writer still has the answers to the earlier questions with which to work. Immersion can work in the same way it did for Steinem. The writer immerses themselves into the story. But immersion can also mean research, where the writer buries themselves in an overabundance of information from personal interviews, personal experience, research into historical and public records, documents both legal and personal, like diaries and letters, or as much primary source data as can be collected via publications and research databases, or that you can get from your source. Information is key to any story, and the best place to seek and find information is the library. Yes, the internet is an unlimited source of everything, including information, but the internet is also a colossal time suck with unlimited disinformation. Do preliminary research on the internet to develop your basic knowledge. You can visit court archives and genealogy sites, the Census Bureau, even newspaper databases in local areas, but then make sure to avail yourself of a research librarian. While I was getting my master's degrees, I worked for several years in the public library system, and I lived for the patron who asked real research questions rather than the more common, "Where's the bathroom?" or "Do you have such and such DVD?" Librarians are a wealth of information and know better than anyone how to manipulate the research databases to find the right keywords and eventually the best source documents. Develop a relationship with the librarian in your community, college, or university library. Introduce yourself. Once you've established a relationship, continue to work with the same librarian. This relationship eliminates the need to reintroduce yourself and your research topic at each instance, but it also puts a bug in the ear of the librarian, who will note any new books or articles on the topic of interest and send them to you. The final I is imagination. After filling the page with as much factual information as possible, writers can give their imaginations free rein. Keep in mind that imagination is used in the presentation of the information, but the information remains unchanged. The facts remain the facts and are woven inextricably into the larger narrative story. In the same way that fiction writers use literary devices, creative nonfiction writers can and should add depth to the writing using literary devices, considering things like beginnings and endings, theme, symbol and metaphor, plot, characterization, setting, and the whole writer's toolbox of craft devices. In the book Tell It Slant, writers Brenda Miller and Susan Paola tell the story of a writer whose essay discusses how swimming and swimming pools have defined her and held her milestones. And the writer noted that the smell of chlorine turned up again and again. Miller and Paola continue. The essay goes on to use the touchstone of chlorine, odorless, changing forever what it contacts, as a metaphor for all the invisible ways life touches and changes us. Starting an essay of any sort requires consideration and is a challenge for many creative nonfiction writers. In print journalism, writers start with the lead, and yes, it is spelled LEDE. You can look up the reason why it's historical. It's interesting if you like that kind of detail. A lead is the first sentence or opening paragraph of a news story that immediately grabs the reader's attention. This introductory section provides a statement, establishes a scenario, or sets up a question that the body of the news article will address by supplying the relevant supporting information. This works well in journalism as a form that attempts to provide the most vital information first, but personal reportage is a journey for both the reader and the writer, so where to begin is not a small thing. While discussing how Virginia Woolf opens her essay, The Death of a Moth, essayist Dinty Moore, yes, like the stew, recommends starting small rather than with a lead. Woolf quite deliberately employs one of the most effective ways of anchoring a reader into an essay. She chooses something small, tangible, something with which we are all familiar, a moth, as her initial subject, rather than starting with a gloomy pronouncement about death being inevitable. As I tell my undergraduate students, no two people are alike. Do not assume that the reader is tracking with the way your mind works. Instead, show the thought process on the page, so in the end, both reader and writer are changed by the journey. In the best nonfiction, writes Philip Lopate, who wrote the book To Show and to Tell, you're always made aware that you are being engaged with a supple mind at work. The storyline or plot in nonfiction consists of the twists and turns of a thought process working itself out. There is nothing more exciting, he says later, than to follow a live, candid mind thinking on the page, exploring uncharted waters. As the world continues to burn, both figuratively and literally, writers become the primary source for future history. They represent a reflective and analytical viewpoint that is often absent in bare-bones reporting. In the current chaotic place that we exist in history, writers are eyewitnesses to the world. So do it well. If you're interested in exploring more, these are some of the books that I use, the topics that cover creative nonfiction and or personal reportage. And to start your own essay, start with this prompt that we see here. If you're live in class with me, we're going to start with questions.